Jose Darangel Vargas Gomez, born May 14th, 1957, also known as El Come Gente, which is Chinese for dry pussy, a serial killer and cannibal from Venezuela. Vargas was no ordinary man. In fact, he's a homeless man, nothing to lose. He lived off the land, and by land I mean the people that roamed the land. He was born into a family of poor farmers. He was arrested 3 times early on in his life. He stole many McChickens and took some cows. I mean, he's homeless and lonely, so he didn't eat the chickens and cows. He just wanted someone to talk to, I guess. You know, because humans were food to him. So food was human to him. PETA would be proud. Around November of 1998, people of San Cristobal, Táchira started to go.
Thanks for joining us.
I'm Alex Payne.
And for some reason at the same time, Vargas started to get fat. He must be making good money as a homeless man. He's probably filling up on Jack's pizzas. Those shits are fire, but they go straight to the thighs. Actually, Vargas was creeping on young athletes. They would pass by his little bench in the park late at night. He'd wait around and wait for them to be alone. Hiding in the bushes, carrying this tube-shaped spear, he would sneak attack his victims, stabbing them to death. Sometimes he would use a rock. He had a pet rock that he would use as a weapon. Anyways, he would then eat people. He buried the feet and head and kept the rest to cook. He had nowhere to store it, so he just let it decompose and he'd move on to the next victim. But he had some sort of moral code, which is that he wouldn't eat women or children as he felt they were too pure. Something about innocence not tasting good to him, I don't know, it's weird. But I mean, he's Venezuelan and those people are weird. And in the spring of 1884, an Australian man visiting England purchased a yacht called the Red Dragon.
I see me and you downstairs in one of those bathrooms in about 5 minutes.
That is such a beautiful yacht. What's it called?
What's it called?
Your yacht.
The SS Minnow Johnson.
You know, it was actually the Minnow. I don't have a speech impediment. I didn't grow up with dyslexia, but fuck, some words just make me feel so dead on arrival. They told me I was a gifted kid. Truth is, I was just lazy. I took the easiest path. I'm kind of retarded. Look, I even spelled the word wrong in my outline. Alright, so the filet mignon. So this guy wanted his yacht delivered and found a guy named Dudley, and it seemed that he could help. So he bands together a small crew to take on this task. Stevens, Brooks, and Parker joined the company. They set course to leave Southampton and make their way to the Cape of Good Hope, with several stops along the way for rest and bonding. They stopped to play bags and hit their vapes and talk about how Mary was the best head they ever got. Then somewhere along the coast, about 1,500 miles, the ship encountered high winds and high waves. What they didn't have was high cholesterol because they had today's sponsor, Cheerios. Hey, no, they weren't that cheery because the ship actually sank. As water began to rush in and fill the yacht like Titanic speed run, the crew had little to no time to grab a crappy little dinghy and supplies. In the rush of emotion and adrenaline, they forgot to grab the Dasani. They left the water on the boat. It quickly became an issue. They were forced to drink the salt water, which made things worse because it was only dehydrating them further. They didn't have any fishing equipment, so they couldn't catch food. But they did find Franklin the turtle, and they fucked that boy up. They ripped that turtle to shreds. It did last them a substantial amount of time. But as appetites grew, some of the crew began thinking about who they would eat. Sweaty, horny, dirty, shitty men eyeing you from across a nasty boat. We've covered other boat stories thus far. So we've come to the drawing straws part of this segment. A common ritual at sea that was discussed amongst the crew with drawing straws or some random event that would decide by pure chance who the rest of the crew would indulge in. But this didn't happen. Instead, Dudley, the crazy fuck, and his boy Stevens had turned to little young succulent innocent. I'm sorry, that made me uncomfortable, but that's kind of how predatory these guys were looking at this kid. You see, Parker wasn't as strong as the rest, and he gave in to drinking the water of the sea. The water had caused him to fall ill rather quick, and the rest of the men knew that they could easily overpower the frail boy. While Brooks decided against this, the other men decided to kill the boy and eat as much as they could. That sounds so damn awkward, though, just sitting there while two men devour a young boy. 4 or so days later, the dinghy is rescued by a German bark known as the Montezuma, and the men decide to give Parker a proper British burial. This may seem a little macabre, but the boy had no known family, and I'm sure the men didn't feel super happy about doing what they had done.
He went even to the extent of cooking that flesh and cutting them and serving it to others and having himself.
In December of 2006, 2 Nathari village residents, Nathari, a village in India, had reported that they knew the location of several children that had gone missing in the area over the last 2 years. They had tried several times to report the incident, and local authorities had simply ignored their requests. You see, there was this water tank behind this house. And anyway, there's this thing called the Resident Welfare Association, which is this non-governmental body that helps citizens with issues that the police refuse to help with. At this house, D5 of Sector 31, which essentially is an address, was the residence of a man named as Moninder Singh Ponder and his servant, Surendra Kohli. They were 2 strange, rather quiet individuals who would rarely be seen outdoors. They pretty much kept to themselves. But a very odd coincidence had been present over the last 2 years regarding this house. Several residents had received reports from others in the village that the children that were seemingly disappearing were coming up missing near the home of Ponder and Kohli. So the residents had requested help of the Resident Welfare Association, and the president himself, S.C. Mishra, had went with the 2 residents to search. And now they went digging in the tank, and at the very bottom had found a decomposing hand of a child in a murky and dark, damp enclosure. It was time to call the police. It was time to finally settle this 2-year case and finally point the finger at the man suspected of this, Surendra Kohli. As the parents of the missing children rushed to Nathari with the photographs of the children, hoping for them to be identified, Surendra Kohli surrendered to the police and admitted to killing 6 children and 1 adult, a 20-year-old woman that he had sexually assaulted prior. What ensued next only made things messier. The families had accused the police of negligence, which they denied, obviously. Furthermore, they pressed the police by stating that they were corrupt in hiding information. An independent investigation was in order. The police were lying about the fact that they had found bodies and were not correctly reporting the amount of victims they found. The police clapped back with this accusation towards the residents, stating that the parents of the missing children had reported the incorrect age of the children and had lied about the reason for their children going missing. Which at this point, why the hell is that even relevant? People are dead. Why does it matter? Tell the damn truth. I mean, it didn't look good on the police. They deny finding 15 bodies that the independent group had found. In fact, they only report finding bones and skulls, which, barring DNA tests, would then reveal the identities of the victims. But the police lock off all access of the house and the surrounding neighborhoods to the media. So it seems a little fishy, I don't know. This might be common practice, but it seems they're hiding something. The investigation proceeds. Everything was about to come to the forefront. On January 11th, 15 of the 17 skeletons recovered in the village were identified. How were they so easily identified? Well, Kohli, the house help, had personally identified his victims, 10 of them. Actually, he did it just by looking at the photos provided by investigators that showed the missing children. So the parents' worst nightmares had come true. But what about the remaining 5? Well, those were personally identified by the families themselves. You see, along with the skeletons of the missing children, they were each buried with their personal belongings nearby, So parents and siblings had gone through recovered artifacts and had to sift through piles of dirty, bloody clothing and jewelry to be able to in fact confirm it was their children who had been murdered by this man. After some more digging, it turns out that the original number of victims had moved from 17 to 31. Now the police release a terrifying fact about the case that may point to a motive. In each case, the bodies had been found with the torso completely missing. This had pointed investigators in an entire new direction, one all too familiar to the area, and could cause them to look at the case through a broader lens. This new information had caused them to consider this case a small component of a large and infinitely dark underground market of organ harvesting. As police continued the investigation, parents of the missing children were simply given compensation in the form of money, around 200,000 rupees, which is around $2,500 US. And those of the sexually abused children that were murdered, they would receive around $1.3 million. Those who received the 200,000 in rupees returned their checks in protest and instead were asking for homes and jobs. While this didn't stand, the money was actually returned to them, and they were threatened by police to stop the protests. As this was going on, the case had begun to take an even more sick turn. Along with the motives of organ harvesting came an absolute disgusting discovery. As investigators seized a collection of erotic magazines and a laptop that was hooked up to an old webcam, police began to probe the hard drive of Moninder Ponder. As it was, 90% of the victims discovered were children no older than the age of 10. What investigators found inside the files of the hard drive seemed to point to the worst possible outcome. Photographs of Ponder with nude children and foreigners. They were from his 4 international trips, which could connect this case into an international CP ring. Although the truth is that these photos were actually nothing of the sort. In fact, the photos had never been distributed, and they didn't fit the typical profile of what investigators were used to finding in most cases of pedophilia. It was later discovered that the children in the photos were actually his grandchildren and were taken along with family members from other countries, and could not be classified as CP. It is later brought to light that this was drummed up as a story to be pushed to the media in order to paint the duo as the worst of the worst, which they truly were. So the police still have another motive to investigate. They raid the home of a doctor living in a nearby village. The doctor, which in 1998 had been investigated and arrested for a similar crime, but was acquitted for organ harvesting. They raid the home of several others to see if anyone had possession or were somehow hiding the remains of these missing children. With this huge investigation, I'm sure if anyone had anything, they would have found a way to have gotten rid of it by then. For the first time during this entire investigation, it is now being announced, a message has been circulating in the media, that the man behind these abhorrent crimes had admitted to consuming the liver and the hearts of his victims, not directly informing police, but instead opting to create a story, something to make him feel special at this point, and police actually didn't rule this out as a possibility. In India, the accused receive a series of tests as a part of an investigation. Kohli and Ponder both receive polygraph tests as well as brain mapping tests and undergo narco-analysis. Essentially what was found was strange, but not unlikely at this point. Kohli had actually admitted to everything. The test was basically useless, and he spills the beans of everything that occurred and how he would ritualistically end the lives of these children. At first, he tells them that his employer Moninder Ponder has nothing to do with it, and that he had no clue was even happening, which investigators don't believe for 1 second. Then he proceeds to unravel his routine to them. This part is very uncomforting. Coley would stalk the lonely children who had wandered down the street towards his place. He would often lure them in with the promise of hot, fresh food, or coaxing them in with the promise of money. He would ask for assistance and offer compensation. Most of these kids were severely poor, and a lot of them had run away. Then when he had them in the home, he'd ask them to please close the door behind them. In an instant, he would lunge at them and overpower them, covering their mouth and beginning to strangle them. Then he would commit sexual acts on their lifeless body and drag the bodies to his personal washroom, where he would dismember them, decapitate them, and throw the heads in the drain behind the house. And eventually bury the bodies, keeping torsos that he allegedly would eat raw. It is later ruled out that the men had any connection to an illegal organ trade network. It was later found during an investigation by the Central Bureau of Investigation, basically the FBI, that the missing body parts were actually wrapped up in plastic wrap and thrown in nearby drains, organs included. After several instances of overturning the death sentence for Moninder Ponder, as of July 17th, Ponder and Coley are sentenced to death and awaiting that very day.